On the war in Gaza and the stalled ceasefire, let's bring in Yaakov Katz, a senior columnist for the Jerusalem Post. Previously, he was the paper's editor-in-chief and its military reporter and defense analyst. He's also the author of several books. Yaakov, good to see you. So first of all, just your response to that interview been conducted with a Hamas official, specifically as it relates to the number of Israeli hostages that remain and their whereabouts. How do you respond to his statement that they have no idea how many are still alive?
Well, I think that Hamas has been playing this game beyond us since the beginning, right? The people got lost in Gaza. They didn't know how many of the hostages were even taken. They didn't know where they were. They've been playing a very cynical game when it comes to the lives of now 116 Israelis who remain inside the Gaza Strip since October 7th. And they do this because they know that this is the way to continue to pierce the hearts of the Israeli people and probably lots of people around the world by keeping them in tunnels, in homes, abusing them. We've heard as opposed to what Osama Hamdan said, that these doctors just say what the Israeli government tells them to say, the atrocities and the sexual abuse and just general abuse that these people have been through should keep us all up at night.
Yeah, that has been well documented. You're right on that point. So the question now, in terms of how to get Hamas to move forward, it seems the ball is in Hamas's court. Israel has, as a whole, signed off on this particular proposal. We've heard from the president and the Secretary of State say that the ball is in Hamas's court, and it's up to them to come up with an answer definitively. I spoke with a former Shin Bet official who spent nearly 200 hours at one point interrogating Yahya Sinwar. And he said, listen, in terms of Yahya Sinwar's time frame here, this could go on for a number of years. And he said, the Shin Bet official, that there needs to be more pressure on from the U.S., not only on Hamas, but in particular Qatar and Egypt, to get Hamas to finally say yes to a deal. Do you agree with that?
I do, because I think that what's, to the America's credit, they've really been trying very hard to achieve a ceasefire deal that would see also the release and the return of the Israelis, at least those who are alive, back to their families and their loved ones. But you need two sides or two parties, two people to tango, and Hamas is not there. And I think that what we're seeing, we saw this in some of the reporting of the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, where they reported on some of the communication between Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, and other terrorist colleagues of his who are based in Qatar. And he says, we have Israel right where we want them. And the people who have been killed, they're just a sacrifice of what we need for our national liberation. I think what Sinwar feels is that the pressure is actually on Israel. Right? They see the condemnations. They see that Israel goes in beyond and rescues 4 of its people, Noah, Shlomi, Almog, and Andre, just last Saturday. And what happens? The whole world accuses Israel of committing a massacre. So why would Sinwar feel the pressure that he needs to come into a deal right now? What could happen, what could change that, is if America says, for example, you know what? We're totally on Israel's side. There's no clock. There's no pressure in Israel. We're actually accelerating weapons deliveries now to Israel. That would get Sinwar to think that something's not working, and he actually has an interest in getting this war done.
And as has been reported, and as you know extensively, this was not a decision that Benjamin Netanyahu came to lightly as well. And many say that just the cynical side of him is probably breathing a sigh of relief that he doesn't have to walk the walk and talk the talk in terms of agreeing to this deal now, because there was a lot of internal pressure and pressure from within his own coalition not to agree to this proposal. Let me ask you about the situation that's continuing to evolve there and concern about a second front really opening up between Israel and Hezbollah, a much stronger party, obviously, than Hamas is, and capable of much more damage to Israel. There are two schools of thought here. That one, that Hassan Nasrallah at the end of the day would rather keep this at a lower temperature, doesn't want to expand to a full-on war. But the other is that, listen, any miscalculation could happen any time. And given what they're capable of, they could very well decide that now is the moment. And the frustration appears to be that, just like with the war in Gaza, at least from Israel's government's perspective, there isn't a day-after plan. There isn't a longer-term plan. There seems to be a day-to-day sort of response. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, you're breaking it down, I think, pretty accurately, Bianna. There's a feeling in Israel, on the one hand, why do we need a second front? It's a much stronger enemy. If Hamas had, I don't know, 30,000 rockets going into this war, 40,000 fighters, Hezbollah is looking at 150,000 rockets and missiles, with some with precision, some with half-ton warheads, some with the ability to strike anywhere inside the state of Israel, where the army talks about 5,000 rockets a day. That would be too many for our missile defense systems, Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, to be able to intercept all of them. And we would see unfortunate devastation and casualties inside Israel, unlike anything we've probably seen before. So people say, if Nasrallah wanted war, there's an easy way for him to do that. Fire a barrage into Haifa or Tel Aviv. As long as he's not doing that, it's just him paying lip service and showing solidarity to Hamas, we can continue to contain this. The other side of it, though, is we've had to evacuate 100,000 people from their homes in the north. We have capabilities that Hezbollah has that at some point, at somewhere down the road, they will use them against us should we not preempt now. And I can tell you that at the Jewish People Policy Institute, a place where I'm a think tank where I'm a fellow, we did a poll this past week which showed that a third of Israelis, it's not a small number, want to see Israel attack Hezbollah right away, now. So it's something that really has the country to some extent torn. What is the right way forward? But I'll just say one last thing. People who say that Netanyahu is undecided on this, that I push back on. He has decided. His decision so far is not to engage, to try to contain the threat from Lebanon for as long as possible.
Yeah, he is somebody who is, at least historically, not been a risk taker. He's been very calculated, although we've seen many faces of Benjamin Netanyahu, especially when he is under pressure. So this really is a tinderbox as we continue to cover the growing escalation. Yaakov Katz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.